Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm somewhat saddened to have so much of this hearing taken up with issues about the wall, because I and all members of this committee have been very bipartisan. We've always been very supportive of the military, but there's some questions I feel that I have to ask. Secretary Shanahan, you testified earlier in answer to Senator Reid's question that you don't know which military construction expenditures are going to be canceled in favor of this $3.6 billion. Is that correct?
Senator, that's correct.
Why is that correct? You've had a month. I find it very hard to believe that there's not a list.
Yeah.
Are you testifying there's no list, there's no information you can give us about which construction projects are on the chopping block?
Yeah. So what I can tell you are what projects aren't on the chopping block. So, for example,
have you assured members of the Senate, individual members, that there are not projects in their states that are under consideration?
No, I have not.
You have not made any assurances to those, to any member of the Senate?
I have had questions as to whether projects, this has been a blanket statement that's been made. There are no projects in this fiscal year that will be canceled. That has been and anything associated with family housing or barracks.
But wasn't the appropriation, the $3.6 billion, I mean, that's part of a larger appropriation for military construction that's been through this Congress, been through the Appropriation Committee? Didn't it list projects?
No, it doesn't. David?
So what he's talking about is the projects when we go to prioritize, when we have the guidance from DHS is the request and the Secretary makes a decision, we'll look at those that are unobligated, meaning the contracts haven't been awarded. And if you look at the—
But those are projects that have been identified. This is, you weren't just saying we'll give you $50 billion for military construction.
No, correct. The projects are individually identified by the Congress and the committees, correct.
But you're telling me that the department has not identified which of those projects are going to be canceled or deferred in order to spend this $3.6 billion on the wall?
We don't know which projects will be deferred. I don't know if the Secretary's decision will be $3.6 billion. He has to determine that it's relevant.
And it's your testimony, Mr. Secretary, that you have not had conversations with members of the Senate to assure them about the safety of projects in their states.
So let me be clear on this. So it's, I have told members there are projects in, and this is writ large, there are no projects scheduled to be obligated in this fiscal year that will be canceled. That's the only information I've shared.
Well, I'm confused. I mean, either projects are going to be canceled to find 3.6 or they're not. Please explain, Mr. Norquist.
Sure. The projects in military construction have up to 5 years to be awarded. And so if you receive funding for a project in 18 or 19, it might not get awarded to 20 or 21.
So you're focusing on the word awarded, but I'm focusing on the fact that these are identified projects in the appropriation, are they not?
Correct, but if—
And Mr. Secretary, are you saying that there are no identified projects in the appropriation for this year that are going to be defunded or deferred because of this 3.6? I mean, this 3.6 is coming from somewhere.
So, okay, so I think you're talking about each other. There's a difference between in the 19 appropriations bill versus projects that are scheduled to be awarded, meaning the contract is going to be funded and the construction would begin in 19. Those projects have up until the year 23 or so to be awarded. And the reason we put the $3.6 billion in the request is so that money would be available and allow those projects continue in many cases.
All right, let me put it another way. I know of projects in New England that were funded in this bill. Can I be assured that they're safe? They're not going to be deferred or canceled to find this 3.6? I mean, something's not computing here. Either the 3.6 is coming from somewhere, and it's coming from projects that were authorized and appropriated by this Congress, and you won't tell me what they are.
The 3.6 will come from project. Well, assuming the Secretary signs off. I don't know the number of the requirement yet, but assuming the Secretary signs off, the 3.6 would in fact come from projects previously authorized and appropriated by Congress. We would look to we would not touch those that dealt with family housing or military construction, and we would prioritize.
Right, I'm going to ask my question once more, Mr.
Sure.
Secretary. Have you spoken to any members of the Senate to assure them that projects in their state are not going to be affected by this, this policy?
No, I have not, Senator.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm very concerned about this. I don't think we're getting full information. I intend to follow up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to follow up on that, as we did have a conversation, and there are 4 projects in Arizona that are appropriate in FY19, and you broadly said those FY19 projects across all the country will not be impacted by this, just to be clear. Yeah. Correct, Mr. Secretary?
That is correct.
Thank you. Just wanted to clear
how does
that
that square with what he just told
me?
me?
Well, you can move on if you get more time, sir, but I got some other questions to ask. I just wanted to clear that up since it seemed that may cause some confusion about some conversations that we had. I want to get to a different topic. In 2017, there were 6,769 sexual assaults reported across our entire military, likely thousands of others that were not reported. These blue-on-blue crimes are unacceptable. They're harming our warriors, and they're degrading good order and discipline and military readiness. Many steps have been taken by the military over the last years and this body, over 100 legislative actions, but it's not enough. There's thousands of our warriors and the military readiness that's been harmed by these crimes. I believe commanders must be educated, equipped, and held accountable and still be responsible for the decisions, the culture, and the discipline regarding sexual assault. However, something needs to change. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Perhaps we need to take a fresh look at this issue. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and more so over the last week. We have weeks now before the NDAA will be marked up before this committee. I am fully locked on like a missile on this target. And I want to be working with you and the military services to take a fresh look at this. I've asked the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff to start with a summit with the Air Force, but it's not just the Air Force, it's across our military services. So can I get your commitment that we are going to partner on this, and we're going to take a fresh look and tackle this over the next 45 days together, which includes being responsive to my questions, maybe forming a team of experts and resources to be able to really dial in as to what's working, what's not working across the spectrum of prevention and response and prosecution. And we can tackle this together, come up with some ideas, impact on the NDAA, culminating with a tank meeting with all the leaders there, with myself, and solve this thing together. Can I get your commitment? You work with me on that?
Senator, you have my commitment.
Thank you. Chairman Dunford?
Absolutely, Senator.
Okay, great. Let's follow up immediately on that. I appreciate it. I want to shift to a different topic. I was over on the Korean Peninsula less than a year ago visiting the troops, and I will tell you, I am so proud of them and their ability to fight tonight and everything that's been done by our military and the services to make sure that we were using all elements of national power to crank up the pressure with a deterrent capability to keep the pressure on North Korea for the negotiations and to thwart the threat that they are. I want to get some clarity, Secretary Shanahan, on exercises. As we know, the military exercises every single day. I mean, every day you're going out with your squadron, your unit, and you are making sure that you are ready to fight tonight. But people rotate in and out over there every year, and so large-scale crisis response exercises are critical for us to have that decision-making process for key leaders at the highest level. So can you just clarify where we are with military exercises on the peninsula and what the decision-making process was on that?
Right. So, Senator, the exercises that we have on the peninsula, which are ongoing as we speak, and the Minister of Defense for South Korea, the ROKs, will come see me at the end of this month, and we'll discuss progress and the findings of those exercises. But they were redesigned this year for 3 things: support the peace process, the expanded responsibilities of the South Koreans in terms of operational control, and to maintain foundational readiness. And underlying all of this is maintaining the readiness we need if we're called to fight tonight.
Right.
We've sustained that readiness.
Okay, so are you, can you say that with the adjustment, I understand turning the volume down so it's not being so provocative, but those higher level operational crisis exercises, the command post level and beyond decision-making for new leaders is really important, right, especially as they rotate so quickly over there. Can you assure us that there will be no degradation in the readiness to fight tonight based on adjustments to the exercises?
I have had personal conversations with General Abrams, and I can assure you there will not be degradation. We will have the capability we need.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses today. Before Secretary Shanahan, before I ask you a few questions, I just want to go back and get a little bit more clarification from some of the answers that I've heard to Senator King and Senator Hirono. I noticed in the budget there is a line for $9.2 billion for emergency for FY20. Is that $9.2 billion that you're asking Congress to appropriate related to the emergency declaration that the President has made?
7.2 billion of it is, and 2 billion is for hurricane.
So you're asking Congress to appoint or to appropriate $7 billion to deal with what the President has declared an emergency. I want to be clear about that.
Correct.
So the Senate, as you know, will be voting later today on a resolution of disapproval relating to this emergency declaration. Is it safe to say you would revise the request for national emergency funding if a majority of the House and the Senate disapproves of the emergency declaration?
I will stick to the budget that we've submitted.
But if there's not if we don't approve of an emergency declaration, why would you come and ask us for money for an emergency declaration?
I will work with this Congress to get the right top line.
So you will look at that and revise it if necessary, if we would disapprove it.
I'll work with the committee and I'll work with the Congress to get the right top line.
Could you describe the department's response to the request for assistance that DHS sent a few weeks ago, and perhaps provide some characterization of the specifics in that request for us? I also serve on the Homeland Security Committee. I think it would be helpful to know.
Right. Which request for assistance is this?
On the southern border?
Is this, yeah, there's been a number of them.
Could you characterize what they've been asking for and what your response?
Right. You want?
Sure.
Okay.
Senator, I'll take that if you don't mind. The most recent request requested our engineers to reinforce some of the infrastructure along the border, and we also have some soldiers that are supporting the detect and monitor mission by manning cameras that allow Customs and Border Protection to see what activity is ongoing around the border. Those are the two primary tasks, and that's, of course, in addition to the National Guard sustained mission, which provides rotary wing aircraft for surveillance, some logistics support, some planning support, and some intelligence along the border.
Thank you. Secretary Shanahan, at your confirmation hearing for the position of Deputy Secretary, I asked you about what was previously known as the third offset that essentially was using technology to improve military tactics and strategy. We had a further conversation about that in my office, and I appreciate that. Your predecessor as Deputy Secretary, Bob Work, championed the initiative and sought out ways to use technology to create and maintain an advantage over our competitors, very similar to what was envisioned in the National Defense Strategy. But now that you've been inside the department, I can ask this question again now as an insider before I asked that prior to your appointment. What is your view on how technology is going to impact warfare? And in particular, give me a sense of how you view the most disruptive technologies to some of our legacy weapon systems that are pretty much ingrained in DOD culture, also tend to be incredibly expensive. But as we're thinking about this budget going forward, that could change very dramatically. Give me your sense and how that is reflected in this budget.
Absolutely. And to Bob Work's credit on the third offset, that was the underpinning for many of the concepts that we're requesting funding for this year. So in terms of the four major disruptive capabilities, there's space, missiles, cyber, and autonomy. So take, for example, missiles in answering your question. Low cost, cost imposing, and attritable versus very expensive manned assets. Same can be said, spoken for cyber, all the effects that you can create with cyber. And when we think about the trade in cost in terms of being able to deploy forces versus effects, significant cost imposition. Space, when we think about having unfettered access to the world, outer space provides us that environment.
So when you're talking about some of, my time is running low, but you're talking about some of this disruptive and autonomy. So when you think about legacy systems of pilots and airplanes and aircraft carriers, things of that nature, all of those things we should be looking at.
Absolutely. I mean, when we think about the challenge to find pilots, that challenge goes away. When we think about surface, subsurface, and the capability to build for lower cost, hide and suspend for longer periods of time, these are real enablers, and the cost to support them is significantly less.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being with us today. Mr. Shanahan, I want to move a little bit of a different direction as we talk about budget and priorities. I'm from Tennessee. I spent 16 years in the House and represented a district that was home to Fort Campbell and many of the enlisted men and women that are there, the 101st, 160th, 5th Division, and have really developed a good working relationship with those families and the enlisted, and also with command teams that have been there, that have done such a terrific job. We have some of those that have served at Fort Campbell that are members of our team. So we hear a good bit from them and hear about their concerns. And I joined Senator Cotton in being tremendously concerned about the Budget Control Act from 2011 with the sequester that was placed on our military. That has not served us well. And my hope is that we're going to be able to solve that situation and address some of the problems that it has brought forward. But one of the things I hear from especially our special operations guys is their desire to make certain that 5G technologies are available to them and that those networks are secure. And I appreciate that in your testimony you mentioned 3 of your priorities as cyber, hypersonics, and space. And we have had our COCOM hearings and have talked some about the placement of these technologies so that we're fighting 21st century warfare and that we're not just focused on today. And I'll tell you one of the things that I've heard a little bit of scuttlebutt about that causes me some concern is that maybe some of the fighter pilots from Air Force are not that excited about having a Space Force that would function there as Air Force. So I want to give you a couple of minutes to talk about Space Force, how you see it standing up, how you expect to deploy it, how you intend to protect the funding for that so that we are looking forward as well as tending to today.
Thank you, Senator. With 2 minutes, I'll go as quickly as I can.
Good.
I'll summarize it this way. Our nation, our $19 trillion economy, and our military, we're carrying too much risk given the vulnerability we have in space, now that space is a contested domain. The Space Force represents a chance to accelerate our ability to respond to that threat environment. The Space Force really gets after 3 items in order for us to reduce that risk. The first is the assets that are in space were never designed to be resilient and deal with the threats that exist today. It's a bit like you can't pick your parents. We need to design new capability and put it up on orbit as quickly as possible. Space Force recommends a space development agency which really gets at cutting the red tape to do development and tapping into commercial space technology, save costs, save time. The second is stand up the Space Command, much like we've done Cyber Command, so that we can focus, have dedicated focus to provide the rules of engagement, authorities, and the tools to defend our assets. And the third is bring together and train make space a dedicated profession where we can provide this cadre of professionals the right training so that they have the ability to have a career that leads to.
Well done in a summary, and now give me 15 seconds on great power competitiveness with China in this arena.
I think we've been ignoring the problem too long.
Well done. Yield back.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. So the administration has submitted a national defense budget request for $750 billion for next year. That is a pretty big number, even by the department's own standards. In fact, the budget rules that govern how much money is available for defense spending is set at $576 billion, which is still a huge sum. But you're requesting $174 billion more than the amount that is allowed by law. $165 billion for the overseas contingency operations, OCO, and another $9 billion for emergency funds for the wall. Now, some of the things in the DOD budget requests seem to me to point in the right direction, more investments in research, for example, and we need to have a much larger conversation about whether these budget caps make sense and how defense and non-defense priorities should stack up. But right now, I just want to dig into how you got your numbers so all of the non-defense budget experts out there can understand the tricks the administration is using to justify skyrocketing defense spending. Secretary Shanahan, the department proposes to get around the budget rules by requesting that $165 billion extra dollars in the OCO account. The amount in the OCO account is not counted towards statutory budget caps. Is that correct? Okay, so let's dig in a bit then on OCO. As the cost to fight the war in Iraq and Afghanistan began to increase in the early 2000s, Congress had to pass emergency supplemental appropriations every year. So in 2009, President Obama established OCO so that they could set aside funds for this and other related operations. And because those funds are for emergencies, they don't count toward the overall limits in defense spending, as you just said. This year's OCO request is a 140% increase from the $69 billion you requested for OCO in last year's budget. So tell me, did the cost of supporting our overseas operations suddenly increase by 140% last year?
Senator, they did not.
They did not. Okay. In fact, the last time OCO account was even close to the amount you've proposed for next year was in 2010, when we had approximately 100,000 troops deployed in Afghanistan and another 50 to 100,000 troops in Iraq. Today, we have about 21,000 troops in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria combined, a number that's largely unchanged from last year. So let me ask another question. Since last year, has the department deployed a large number of troops to fight a war someplace other than Iraq, Syria, or Afghanistan?
Senator, no, we have not.
Okay, so the actual cost of supporting operations overseas did not increase by 140%, and we haven't launched a war someplace else, triggering that kind of emergency. And yet you're asking for $165 billion for, quote, overseas contingency operations. I just want to be absolutely clear so the taxpayer understands. You're requesting funding in OCO to fund activities that have nothing to do with the reason that OCO was established. Is that correct?
What we've done this year is we've taken our base budget from last year and for the chairman's blueprint, grown our budget 3% in real growth.
Oh, okay, I appreciate it, but you can just answer my question, and that is, you're requesting funding in OCO to fund activities that have nothing to do with the reason that OCO was established. Is that right?
So, Senator, to make it transparent, if you go through the budget material, we've got it in two groups. One is what you think of as traditional OCO, and the other is clearly labeled OCO for base. And that's the distinction you're looking for.
You can call it whatever you want. We know why OCO was established. And my question is, are you asking for this increase for the reasons that OCO was originally established? It's an easy question. No. Secretary Shanahan?
No, we're asking for $750 billion top line, and we want to work with this committee to get the appropriation and authorizations. proper.
You're asking for an increase in OCO for purposes that OCO was not established. In fact, your own staff said so yesterday. They said you're asking at least for $98 billion for things that have nothing to do with contingency operations, and I'm not quite sure why you can't say that. What we're really talking about here is the establishment of a slush fund to hide what's happening with defense spending and get it out from underneath the statutory caps. I think it's time to stop this business of more for the military. And establishing a slush fund like this and saying, oh, because we put it in two different accounts, somehow changes the fact, it's just not true. And we just need to be honest with the American people about how much we're spending here.
Senator, we have provided in our justification books 100% transparency. There is no slush fund. We can take the money and tie it back to the National Defense Strategy and what we need to defend America.
I have no doubt that you
Warren.
see this as more.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Let me start by saying that, first a note just about Fort Leonard Wood. I'm looking forward to seeing the budget justification books next week so we can see the details here about the budget itself. I'm anticipating it will include an increase for the Army's chemical school at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, my home state. And these are professional soldiers, of course, who train and respond to an adversary's use of chemical weapons on the battlefield. 4 of the 5 threats, I'm struck, called out in the National Defense Strategy have a chemical weapons capability. And by investing in places like Fort Leonard Wood, we ultimately, of course, save lives on the battlefield. So I'm very proud of the work that they do and look forward to the continuing support, the Department's continuing support for their important mission. Let me just shift and ask about our challenge in emerging technologies, cyber and space, in particular China's investment in those areas and our eroding advantage. I was struck, Mr. Secretary, by a comment that you make in your written testimony. You say some U.S. companies have voiced ethical qualms about working with DOD to develop advanced technology, in some cases even terminating relationships, often while continuing to work with China. What are we talking about here?
I think we're talking about Google and their support to China and their lack of support to the Department of Defense.
So Google has refused to work with the Department of Defense, actually was under contract, weren't they, with the Department of Defense? Tell us about that.
Well, they haven't refused. They just have said they're not going to continue to do business with the Department of Defense on certain contracts.
But they are doing business in China in a way that benefits, you're saying, our Chinese competitors.
Correct.
Say more about that.
Well, the interesting thing, and this is why this is such an important issue for our country, the fusion of commercial business with military is significant. $5 trillion of their economy is state-owned enterprises. So the technology that is developed in the civil world transfers to the military world. It's a direct pipeline. Not only is there a transfer, there's also systemic theft of U.S. technology that facilitates even faster development of emerging technology.
So I just want to make sure that I understand exactly what you're saying. You're telling me that Google, an American company, supposedly, is refusing to work with the Department of Defense, but is doing work with China, in a way that at least indirectly benefits the Chinese government. Is that correct?
I haven't heard the word refuse, but there's a lack of willingness to support DOD programs.
General, you're nodding your head. Do you want to weigh in on this?
No, Senator, I'm nodding your head on exactly the point that you made, that the work that Google is doing in China is indirectly benefiting the Chinese military. And I've been very public on this issue as well. In fact, the way I described it to our industry partners is, look, we're the good guys. In the values that we represent, in the system that we represent, is the one that will allow and has allowed you to thrive, and that's the way I've characterized it. So I was just nodding that what the Secretary was articulating is a general sense of all of us as leaders, and we watch with great concern when industry partners work in China, knowing that there is that indirect benefit. And frankly, indirect may be not a full characterization of the way it really is. It's more of a direct benefit to the Chinese military.
I just want to underscore this for the record so that we are absolutely, perfectly, 100% clear here that Google, an American company based in this country, so again, it's supposedly an American company, is doing work in China that directly or indirectly benefits the Chinese government at a time of increased peer competition with this country. We are in a struggle with the Chinese government over whether or not they're going to become a regional and maybe global hegemon with values very different from ours, certainly values that do not favor freedom in the world. And we have an American company that does not want to do work with our Defense Department, which is one thing, but they're happy to help the Chinese, at least the Chinese government, that is, the Chinese military, at least indirectly. I think that's just extraordinary. What do we do in my time remaining, Mr. Secretary? Tell us what, from your perspective, we need to do to maintain our competitive advantage on AI and these emerging technologies. What do we need to see going forward?
We need to, well, two things. One, we need to continue to invest, and this year's budget doubles our investment in artificial intelligence. And then the string that you're really pulling on, the talent is in this country. We need to use the talent in this country. The talent in this country needs to support our great power competition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shanahan, I'd like to follow up on the line of questioning from my colleague from Arizona, Senator McSally. I think there's no doubt we'll continue to see tensions in North Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, after the latest breakdown in talks between the President and Chairman Kim. How do you plan to use your position as Acting Secretary of Defense to reassure our allies in the region? We know our great friends, the Republic of Korea and Japan, have a much more tense and complicated relationship with each other. For example, there were questions about them sharing NEO plans with one another. What do you plan to do to work on bridging that gap?
Thank you for that question, Senator. That gap can be bridged at, I'll say, 3 different levels. There's a relationship level, and I have relationships with the Defense Minister for Japan as well as the Republic of Korea, so it's important that I play a role in keeping the 2 countries together there. Exercises that we'll do together, technology that we'll develop together, particularly in the area of missile defense. As you well know, it's a sizable investment by the government of Japan is to put Aegis ashore, as well as develop other, I'll say it, defensive capabilities in the event of an escalating situation on the peninsula.
So you had answered Senator McSally saying that there would not be any degradation of our relationship and readiness as it pertains to military exercises. But are you changing the nature of those exercises to, for example, simply being tabletop exercises or just computer exercises as opposed to how they've been conducted in the past?
Senator, if you don't mind taking that
Yes,
question.
of course.
The way I would describe it, and you're quite familiar with this, what we have changed, and I want to be clear, is we've changed the method of training to focus on the mission essential tasks that each of the levels of command needs to be proficient in. What we haven't changed is the outcome and the readiness to fight tonight. So the way you characterize it is in part true, that some of our large-scale exercises are done now with simulation, CPX, command post exercise, and so forth. But what's really important to highlight is that at the battalion and the squadron level and below, there's been no changes to training and the ability of our men and women on the peninsula to train in the integration of combined arms. Where we've made adjustments for large-scale exercises, and what we've done is, very quickly, I'll just try to highlight, we've shifted from certifying our readiness based on the conduct of an exercise to a much more complex system that General Abrams and Admiral Davison have developed, which identified all the mission essential tasks for every level of command in making sure that we have a proven method of developing proficiency. And the other thing I can assure you is that as soon as General Abrams and Admiral Davison have any concerns about their ability to maintain readiness, and right now we're executing their plan, they know that they come right back to the Secretary and I, and we will work with the Koreans to make adjustments. But I can assure you from a military perspective right now, I am quite confident in our 2019 training plan and confident that that will deliver the level of readiness that we have historically done, accomplished in large-scale exercises.
So you're saying that for brigade and below, or battalion and below, there's no change as far as the leaders that see what's happening?
That is correct. That's an important point, Senator. That is correct.
So above brigade, that's where the changes have
That's
taken
where
place?
the changes are, and in some cases, it's dialing down the volume of the exercises. As you know well, those exercises had two purposes. One was deterrence, one was proficiency. I'm confident right now that our exercise program does deliver the latter, proficiency in our mission essential tasks.
Have those exercises taken into account the role of logistics in sustaining any type of a fight that we would have to engage in? I do think that we focus on what's happening on the peninsula, but sustaining that fight long-term and getting whatever we need, resources there, is a real challenge. The Pacific, as many people, I don't know if people realize how vast the Pacific Ocean is. Right. Can you speak a little bit to the logistical challenges?
Senator, I can. In fact, this past year, we did what we call a Korea readiness review. And we played out the first 60 days of a Korean conflict to include the detailed logistics planning that was necessary to support operations for the first 60 days. We, needless to say, learned a lot during that exercise, but our exercises absolutely include the logistics factors associated with our ability to conduct operations.
Thank you. Our national defense strategy outlines a shift in primary focus from countering violent extremism to great power competition. As acting secretary, Mr. Shanahan, what specifically do you plan to do in areas perhaps less obviously impacted by either of these priorities, for example, Southcom or AFRICOM?
Southcom and AFRICOM are critical in terms of defeating ISIS, dealing with regional threats. The chairman, in his role as the integrated global campaign planner, we make sure that the risk in those areas and the resources required to manage are properly delivered, both to Southcom and AFRICOM.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for your service and for your candor today. Now, as I listened to Senator Fisher talk about and ask about nuclear modernization, I wanted to follow up on that. And then I heard Senator Blackburn talk about Space Force, and I wanted to follow up on that. So I'm going to try to combine the two as quickly as I can because I think there are some similarities. And I'll start with you, Secretary Shanahan. You know, many of the critics of nuclear modernization imply or state emphatically that we can't afford that it's unaffordable, that in fact we had to choose, in essence, between nuclear or conventional modernization. And yet, as I look at the budget historically, and as I look at the budget going forward, I see, for the most part, a peaking of modernization costs for the nuclear force at under 6.5% in year 2029. Can we afford not to do it? I mean, it seems to me that that's a pretty efficient use of deterrence dollars, and I'd just like to hear you elaborate a little bit on whether we can afford it.
I'll ask David to talk about the affordability, but as our competitors are building up their nuclear capabilities, this is setting aside budget, as our competitors are building up their nuclear capability or modernizing, we should not unilaterally disarm. I think we have to start there. In terms of timing of the budget, David, maybe you could speak to that.
So, Senator, the numbers you used are correct. The peak is about 6.5%. When you realize that in normal maintenance runs 3%, right? That's that increase for the amount of peace and stability that deterrent provides us against what is probably the most catastrophic threat we can face, I think is a reasonable and sound approach, and something that you'd want to be very careful about changing because of the stability that it provides globally and for the safety of the American people.
Okay, so then let's move to space, because I think I have a similar line of questioning as it relates to the affordability of it. I understand concerns. It's easy to see why somebody that has a particular system within the Air Force might feel threatened by a competing for limited dollars. And Secretary Shanahan, I think you've referenced it, at least to some degree, and I'd like to have you elaborate even a little more on the efficiencies that can be found. Clearly, space is a realm that we're competing in. Clearly, we need to probably ramp up some of our capabilities there, as you pointed out earlier. We can't pick our parents. The resiliency isn't what it needs to be, and yet. Maybe you could speak to, and maybe this would be a good one for the comptroller as well, to the efficiencies that will be found in the process of creating a Space Force as a sixth branch.
I think on the efficiency side, and I've had conversations with Senator Reid on this subject, and many in Congress are experts in this area. We can't build a bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. In standing up the Space Force, we have a chance to build it from the bottom up. I think we'll build the bureaucracy if we build it from the top down. So it's an opportunity to build it correctly. The biggest effort needs to be at retiring the risk. We're too vulnerable. And, you know, it's a little bit like the nuclear conversation. I actually think it's going to cost us less. I mean, I've had lots of arguments about whether that's true or not. I think at the end of the day, I mean, what we hear quite a bit is this is change versus the status quo. This is a fundamental structural change. But in that structural change, we'll get after reducing our vulnerability, and I really believe at the end of the day have more capability and more money in terms of we won't spend as much.
Well, and maybe speak a little bit to the realigning of existing space programs as part of that efficiency, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When we talk about standing up a new service, this is a very small service. You think about 15 to 18,000 people, so it's really not about a large group being consolidated. This is really talking about how do you consolidate development efforts within the department. So how do we take what's being done? You know, the Army is going to undertake a brand new modernization program. Mm-hmm. How do we combine that with work going on in the Air Force, with what's going on in the Navy, and then integrate it into all the combatant commands? This is really about doing it at a DOD level, and these are like once-in-a-generation opportunities. Since we must address the contested environment, and we're going to make significant changes, why not do it at an integrated level for the department instead of, in each service?
Mm-hmm. Well, your answers were as efficient as I expect the Space Force to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The minority leader had a question and has a scheduling problem, so let's go ahead and recognize him, and we'll get to the rest of them if that's acceptable.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're very gracious. I appreciate it. I'm trying to clarify the debate that Senator King initiated about projects at risk, and I'm going to take the really, really dangerous path for a social scientist to try to break it down into simple numbers, particularly dealing with an engineer and a numbers person. And bear with me. Let's say X equals the authorized MILCON for the last 5 years. That's the universe. Y equals the unobligated MILCON project after September 30th of this year. X minus Y or Z equals those projects that are risk of being captured for the wall, with some limited exceptions. No public housing, et cetera. You know what that Z is right now. You have the list. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman? You have the ability to create the list.
Let me make sure I understand what Z is. I'm going to look at my friend here.
Okay.
Okay. So Z is, go ahead. Go ahead. We know what that universe of projects is.
If the question is, what is the universe of either unobligated projects or unobligated projects after a certain date? Those are things that can be generated, yes.
Exactly. And those projects, with the exceptions you've mentioned, family housing and some others, are all subject to being taken away to fund this wall. They might not all be taken, but they are the projects at risk, correct?
That's the pool.
I would like that list today, Mr. Secretary.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. So we'll be waiting. I'll be my fingers, and we'll have that list. So everyone will know is that what project they have to worry about going forward.
Okay.
Is that it?
No, thank you for the clarification.
That's the deal?
Yeah, that's the deal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Heinrich.
Can I assume that there are congressionally appropriated FY19 projects that received military construction funding that are going to be in that list? Okay.
5-year monies?
Because they're 5-year monies, yes.
Yeah, I can't tell you, Mr. Chairman, how inappropriate I think that is. Congress has the power of the purse. This is wrong. This is abusive. and we should do something about it, all of us. Because I guarantee you, if you let this happen, it will happen under the next president and the next president, and you won't always like how this money gets spent. Acting Secretary, how much do you know about PFAS?
Well, I understand the nature of the chemical. So when we talk about it being a fire retardant and being used over extensively, militarily and commercially, and the issue of it being in the water supply.
So have you had a chance to read the article in the New York Times this morning with the headline, Pentagon pushes for weaker standards on chemicals contaminating drinking water?
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to read the paper.
I would ask that you read that.
Sure.
I hope it's highly inaccurate. The second clause in the first sentence says that the Pentagon is pushing the Trump administration to adopt a weaker standard for groundwater pollution.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any conversations going on in the Pentagon that would push for a standard that was not set by the best available science?
Right. I'm not aware of any conversation, and I shared with Senator Shanahan that I would follow up with her also on this matter after I have a chance to investigate, and I'll do the same with you.
I would deeply appreciate that. The right way to do this is to follow the science.
Right.
The right way to do this is not to set a standard based on trying to limit liability.
Right.
I know that we're going to have a big price tag attached to this. There is no question about that. But we're also going to have a very big human cost associated with this. And I'll just give you one example. Highland Dairy Farm was forced to close its doors in New Mexico after 25 years as a local business. For months, because of this contamination, they had to dump 12,000 to 15,000 gallons of milk per day. That's enough to give a carton at lunch to 240,000 kids. That is one example of how this is impacting the communities that have been enthusiastic about hosting our Air Force and other military establishments. We are going to need to get in front of this, and I don't think it has received adequate attention from the Pentagon. And so I look forward to working with you on that, but we're at the front end of this, and there's going to be a lot of work that's going to have to go into trying to make this right for these communities. I very much agree that our competitors are rapidly fielding new capabilities in the space domain and that we need to move with a greater sense of urgency. I welcome the increased prioritization the department has put on this area, and you're focused on that. And in terms of R&D, as we stand up a space development agency, one of the things I want to make sure we're not doing is reorganizing the existing pieces or reinventing the wheel. Things like the Space Rapid Capabilities Office, the Space Vehicles Directorate, the Advanced Systems Directorate, and many others all play a critical role in researching, developing, and fielding our nation's space system. So I would just urge you, as you look at that, and urge Secretary Wilson, Dr. Fred Kennedy, Dr. Mike Griffin, all to fully utilize the existing R&D assets as you stand up SDA, so that we're not losing a few years of reorganization to make the whole system work better. And if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them.
No, when I think of the Space Development Agency, what I don't want it to be is a reorganization. The number one element of the Space Development Agency that we need to take advantage of is large-scale systems engineering. How do we put together a national team so that we can do this at scale? There is incredible technology in the Air Force. We don't lack for talent. That is not our issue. We don't lack for money. The architecture that's required to be able to do this quickly so that we don't have to do it 3 or 4 times is really the problem we have to get after.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. Senator Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today and for the service for provided this country, and to all those behind you for their service as well. You know, as we approach these hearings, we hear a lot about the threat assessments and our nuclear capabilities and our hardware. Often we overlook sometimes the very human element of this. And as you probably are aware, this committee's had a couple of hearings about some serious, I think very serious, ongoing health and safety problems with privatized housing on our military bases. Some of those have occurred in my state at Maxwell Air Force Base and at Fort Rucker. And I did not notice any language in either of your statements on this particular topic. Not surprising. I'm not criticizing that. But I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on these issues and whether or not any of these issues are going to be resolved through the budget that you're proposing this year. And I'll ask it to Secretary Shanahan and General Dunford.
Yeah,
I think
so
all the rest of it.
maybe I'll just start out with,
I don't think anyone else.
it's an embarrassment where we are, so I'm not going to defend anything. It's a leadership failure. Once we get past that, it's what are we going to do about it? I've had considerable interactions with the service secretaries, and they've assured me for the time being they'd like to run with the lead to address the problem. But the conversations I've had with them are like this. It's okay if we identify the problem. Let's make sure we put the resources that are required to be responsive in place. That's what I intend to follow up on. And the second piece is we can't fall into this hole again. So what is the enduring issue? But for the families that are in these, the service members and their families, we need to rapidly address the problem. Let's make sure the resources are put in place.
General?
Senator, I agree with the characterization of the problem, the Secretary's comments about the sense of embarrassment, about the conditions that we found recently in family housing. The Secretary talked about it from a resource perspective. I can assure you that the leadership in the department has gripped this issue, and the services have done things like make sure that a leader goes and visits each and every individual's home so we have a personal, hands-on view of the conditions under which our men and women are living. And when the Secretary talks about a leadership challenge, it's very simple what happened. We contracted out for family housing some years ago, and a gap grew between leadership and the contractor. And that should not be the case. Leadership should be decisively engaged in the overseeing of those contracts, and more importantly, should be decisively engaged in the challenges that our men and women have in family housing. And so there is a resource issue that you spoke about. There is a human element to it, which is the men and women in those houses. But there's also the important leadership point that the Secretary mentioned, and that is making sure that our leaders are, in fact, decisively engaged in all aspects of our men and women's lives, in particular their housing.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both. And the resources, I'm assuming, are talking about our military and the various leaders on the bases getting to the bottom of this and trying to correct it. But I'm hoping that the resources to actually correct these problems are going to be borne by these companies who are making the profits.
And that's my concern, is we'll identify the issues, and then we'll say we'll fix them, but it'll take too long. We need to fix them quickly, and if it means getting extra resources, these companies, they need to find a way to do that.
All right, thank you. There's nothing in the budget, though, that we're looking at to budget to actually fix the resources as opposed to first looking to the contractors. Would that be fair?
We are first looking to the contractors to do it. We have resources in the budget should the committee want to address additional things, but the contractors are the one responsible for delivering the service at the rate they were funded.
All right, great. Secretary Shanahan, I'm really interested in additional funding in the budget for hypersonics and directed energy programs. A lot of that work is going on in my state up in Huntsville. Are you anticipating any new programs or more funding for existing programs in those areas?
Well, this budget has a sizable increase in hypersonics, and then we continue to double down on directed energy. Most of the focus in directed energy is to get a form factor so we can operationally deploy these concepts. But you'll continue to see more and more funding going towards these technologies.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the time.
Senator Jones, Senator Wicker.
Thank you very much. General Dunford, thank you so much for being here, and thanks for dropping by and chatting with us the other day at my office. Let me ask you about LHAs and LPDs. There's pressure to build a fleet better able to face Chinese and Russian precision missiles. The Navy, therefore, appears to be reducing its investment in warships like LPDs, big deck, amphibs, and aircraft carriers to free up money for more offensive weaponry on smaller surface ships, submarines, and aircraft. Additionally, moving the build of the new amphibious ships into the future would likely delay the Navy's ability to reach its goal of 38 amphibious ships from the current level of 32. General, does the Marine Corps still have a stated need for 38 amphibious ships, as indicated in the Navy's force structure assessment? How many amphibs do we have in the inventory today, and do you foresee eliminating Marine Corps mission of amphibious operations at any point in the near future?
Senator, the requirement you identified of 38 is still a requirement. I went back after our conversation to just check to make sure what the facts were. The requirement is 38. The 355 ship program of record that was submitted last year, I think they work on minor adjustments, but there's still a cardinal direction of the Navy. And the issue with the amphib ships inside of this program was an issue of sequencing. The Navy put a higher priority on other platforms during this period of time, but did not walk away from the requirement or the long-term plan to have those ships in place.
Now, in terms of facing the Chinese and Russian threat, just inform the public through the mechanism of this hearing how the amphibs fit into that.
Senator, it's critical for us to be able to project power in the context of China and to seize. One of the traditional missions of the Marine Corps is seizing advanced naval bases, and if you look at the island chains and so forth in the Pacific as platforms from which we can project power, that would be an historical mission the Marine Corps has, and one that is very relevant in the China scenario.
Projecting power with Marines being transported by these amphibs.
That is correct, Senator.
Right. Secretary Shanahan, last year Congress appropriated considerable funds toward both LHA 9 and LPD 31, yet those two ships were not funded in this year's budget request. We just heard General Dunford's answer. So why did the department withhold funding for LHA 9 and LPD 31 in this year's budget? If both of these ships are going to be built at some point, wouldn't you agree that we should fund them in the most cost-effective manner? And were both the Navy and Marine Corps in agreement with this decision to delay funding of the LHA 9 and LPD 31?
Yeah, Senator, what I recall in the development of the plan, it was a sequencing, not a requirement issue. In terms of, General, you know in terms of providing the availability. Yeah.
You know, Senator, the issue, when they looked at all the money that was available to the Navy, and they looked at the shipbuilding plan, they prioritized other platforms within this program over those two amphibious ships, and they moved those two amphibious ships outside the program without adjusting the requirement. Okay, so the requirement's there, but the subpart of my question about the efficiency of building them in the most cost-effective and efficient manner. Would you, either of you care to comment on that? Wouldn't it make sense to do it in the most efficient manner?
It would.
And what has been proposed is not necessarily that, is it?
I can't speak to the specific.
Could you, General Dunford?
Not with regard to what the difference would be in the cost of the ship or the efficiency within the program as opposed to outside the program. I can't talk to that, Senator, but we could get back to him that specific question.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator. Senator. Yeah. Senator Manchin, I believe. He was here. Yeah. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you. I'm so sorry. Sometimes we get shortchanged here, and we have to go to different meetings, and I'm handling an energy meeting now, but I just want to thank you all so much. And so Secretary Shanahan, as you know, state-owned National Guard facilities that cause PFAS contamination do not have access to defense environmental restoration dollars like active duty bases do. And Senator Gillibrand had a situation similar to what I had in Martinsburg, and I think you're familiar with both of those. So I think my question would be, National Guard units use the same firefighting foam that the active components use. The training is often the same. It makes no sense for the National Guard to not have access to these dollars. So would you be supportive of a similar amendment this year if we could get access to them?
Yes, I would.
Okay. And you've been brought up to speed on that.
I'm not totally up to speed on that particular.
We'd love to, if we could, you tell us who to designate on your staff, and we'd love to bring you up to speed because it would be very helpful because it's really been detrimental to the community. The President's budget request is something I wanted to go over. The combination of emergency fund as well as other budget shell games gave us an $8.6 billion. And I think you all might have touched on this. What we're looking at is a holistic approach of how we're able to secure our border and really the immigration challenges we have. Do you all know how many of the, maybe you have this, as far as the DACA, some DACA children that are involved in the military? Do you have any idea? It would be helpful to us if we could find out how many of these young people are participating in defending our country that are asking to be considered as being available to be a citizen of our country. I think it would be quite appropriate for us to be able to know that. Again, the big thing with me when Senator, God rest his soul, Senator McCain was here is the audit. And you might have touched on this, and a question might have been asked if there's something on the audit that you can give me an update on where we are, what your intentions are, and how we can get a complete audit of the Department of Defense would be very, very, very helpful.
Senator, I'm always happy to give an update on the audit for you.
Okay.
So we've completed the first-year audit. We received over 2,300 findings. We have corrective action plans that each of the services are developing to address those. The major areas of focus this year are particularly inventory, information, technology, and real property. Those services will be executing those. The auditors have already started the second audit. They don't wait. They come right back and begin the next year. They'll be testing the progress on those, and I think we do twice-a-year updates to the committee staff, and we expect the reports to be completed and delivered to us on the second-year audit on November 15th.
The other thing I need to know and have more information, whoever would be responsible for, is the procurement. How the procurements we handle, the change has been made in procuring. You know, all the different types of anecdotes and jokes have been made about how we buy things and what we pay for things and things of that sort. I like to be able to go back to the citizens of West Virginia and say that we are investing the money properly. They have total support, and they have given total support for the military. They want to make sure that we're using their resources in the most prudent way.
Senator, we'd be happy to put together for you to be able to share, here's how we've been saving money, here's where we've been saving money, here are plans to save even more.
The other thing, Secretary Shanahan, is on the F-15X. If you could explain to me a little bit about that. If the experts in the air combat and the Air Force didn't identify a need for the F-15X, then what does OSD know that the Air Force doesn't about the future threat environment?
No. Yeah, let me address that. So my responsibility in pulling together the budget is to make sure we identify what are the threats and campaigns that we need to structure, develop, do force design and force development. Mm-hmm. The services, the joint staff, and the cost assessment and performance evaluation organizations then do the analysis. So I'd ask the chairman on what the recommendation in terms of mix of tactical aircraft.
Senator, I spoke at length with the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and others on this issue, and so I can give you the framework for making a decision.
Sure.
First, the primary aircraft of the future for the Air Force is the F-35, and they're not walking back off that program or the importance of the F-35 program. But as they looked over the next several years, they had two problems. They had one capability represented by the fifth-generation aircraft, the F-35, and then they had a capacity issue, both numbers of aircraft plus the amount of ordnance that could be carried by those aircraft. And then they had the F-15C, which was aging out in the 2027, 2028 period. Mm-hmm. So within the next 5 or 10 years, the best solution was to go to the F-15, it's called EX, platform to backfill the F-15 Eventually, we'll get to an all F-35 program, but from both a cost perspective and a capacity perspective, this particular mix of aircraft to the near term was determined to be the right mix of aircraft. So again, not walking off the 5th generation, but the near term need that combination of a 4th generation and a 5th generation to generate capacity. And I would add that the F-15X is slightly less expensive for procurement than the F-35, but it's more than 50% cheaper to operate over time, and it has twice as many hours in terms of how long it lasts.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony and service. I was late to the hearing today because Secretary Esper asked me to accompany him to Fort Belvoir to visit with military families about the housing issues. And I got to tell you, I did a visit on Norfolk Naval Base last Friday, so my expectations were pretty darn low. But I'm just stunned after talking to these families. The physical condition of their units, mold, water damage, poor shoddy construction, poor shoddy repairs, the lack of responsiveness, that they can't get response from the housing companies, that they're told when they go to chain of command, we don't do this anymore, we don't have any responsibility, that when they do get a response, the quality of the repair work done both by the maintenance connected with the companies or contractors they come up with is atrocious. But then what I really heard about today was the number of people who are getting sick. Hospitalizations, families being forced to move out of units for significant amount of time as their units are being repaired so that they can be habitable. Carbon monoxide, CO2 monitors going off and people being told it's fine, you can move back in, but not being told what was wrong that was causing there to be CO2. A 10-year-old girl, mother just told me this within the last hour, missed 45 days of school last year. That's 1/4 of the school year because of respiratory problems caused by mold in the unit. And so I know that you're focused on this, but I just got to say, as the father of a Marine, as somebody who is in a state that's heavily military, it was just absolutely depressing, the physical conditions, and we've got to have both housing companies that will improve and a military that will fix. I have been pointing out nobody enlisted to be a tenant of Lincoln Housing. They enlisted to be a Marine or an airman or woman or a soldier or a sailor, and so it's the military that's got to fix it. I want to focus on the emergency issue. Secretary Shanahan, my reading of Title 10, Section 2808 is that the President can continue to use unobligated MILCON dollars for the duration of the emergency. So having declared an emergency, unless Congress rebuts that, as long as the President says they're an emergency, we basically are tapping a spigot into the MILCON budget for this budget year and future budget years until the emergency is declared over. Is that your understanding of the section?
Yeah, my understanding is as long as there's a declaration of emergency, that is an authority that goes along with the declaration.
So I just want to make plain to everybody what we're voting on this afternoon. We're voting on an emergency declaration that until this President says there's not an emergency, it is a spigot tapped into the MILCON budget that can allow not only 2019 funds, but 2020 funds, 2021, future funds to be pulled out of the MILCON budget at the President's discretion, in my view, counter to the appropriations powers of Congress. Secretary Shanahan, I wrote you a letter on February 15 asking you for information about MILCON projects, unobligated MILCON projects that could be affected by the President's emergency declaration. My understanding is the committee staff has been repeatedly in contact with your office on the same thing. I was not here, but I understand that you committed to Senator Reid that you will get him that list today. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, I got to tell you, I feel completely sandbagged.
Yeah.
The service secretaries have had that list. They've had the list. The service secretaries have been willing to share the list of their unobligated MILCON projects. So you're going to send it to us today after the vote on the emergency declaration? Members of the Senate are entitled to know from where these MILCON monies will be pulled. And the fact that you come here today and say you'll now give it to us right after the vote this afternoon, your service secretaries and chiefs have had these lists, and when we've asked them to send them to the committee, they've said we can't without the permission of the SecDef. So were they only available in the last half hour?
No, first of all, Senator, I think the situation is being misrepresented. There has not been a deliberate attempt to withhold any information to this committee.
Let me state this to you. The staff has been reaching out to the service secretaries and saying, send us the list of unobligated MILCON projects. Right. They have been told that they cannot do that. It has to come through the OSD. Right. Right. And you're now going to produce that list today after we have a vote at 1:45? This information is highly relevant to the senators who are voting on this emergency declaration. Because the question is, should a president be able to declare a non-military emergency, that's what the military has testified, and then ransack the Pentagon budget for $6.1 billion? I think we're entitled to know where the money might come from, especially since you just said this is a multi-year declaration that opens up a spigot into the MILCON budget. I don't think you giving us that list today after the vote, when we've been asking for it for a month, is a good faith response to the request of this committee. Now tell me if I'm misrepresenting what's going on.
Throughout this process of the emergency declaration, and I just have to say, this is not something we do every day. From the very start, we have worked to be 100% transparent with Congress, 100%.
I agree you don't do an emergency declaration every day, but every day you have a list of unobligated MILCON projects, don't you?
Well, I think the list, we've always had a list of, that's how we keep book. I mean, it's not like we don't have a list of projects.
But why wouldn't your services share those with the committee after continuing requests from the committee?
Senator Kane, your time is long expired, and I know the passion that you feel right now, but we are adjourned.
Chairman, I had a couple of follow-up questions.
Well, I know you did.
Are we adjourned?
You know, I have to say this about Senator King, and I say this in front of all of my, well, they're gone now. Of all the members, Democrat and Republican, you are the one who has been the most responsible. You've been to every single meeting. No one else can say that. And even though it'd be a violation of what we're going to do, if you want to have a withdrawal of that just long enough for you to do one question. Only because it's you. You got it? Nope.
All right, one comment, one question. The comment is I want to compliment Mr. Norquist for the work that he's done. I failed to do that before. Working through the audit process for the Defense Department is a Herculean task, and you were embarked on it well and truly, and I compliment you on that. I qualify that a little bit by the invention of the phrase today, OCO for base. That's like rabbit for bicycle. I mean, those two things aren't really consistent. My follow-up question, Mr. Secretary, based upon all this discussion, and I'm honestly confused. My father used to say, the Pentagon is the only building in America you can drive straight toward, and it keeps getting further away. And I feel a little bit like that today. Is it your testimony that 2019 military construction projects that were authorized and appropriated for are off the table, or are they only off the table if they're obligated before September 30th? Fairly straightforward question. Mr. Norquist, perhaps you can answer. Microphone,
I'm
please.
sorry, I turned it off instead of on. My apologies. Senator, it's the award date. What we're looking at and prioritizing is contracts that award later. So if you look,
so if there's a project in the 2019 bill that hasn't been awarded, it's potentially on the chopping block. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We are adjourned.